Thank you very much. I'm sharing my slides. Okay, yeah, I rephrased my title because I got aware while writing my text that I was focusing specifically on social confinement. So, Uncanny Carter of social confinement. Uh, well, the Heideggerian analysis of angst, being and time, represents a full-fledged practical reinterpretation of the phenomenological epoche, provided that what angst is about is not an inner worldly being. It renders the world we live by, and as we know it, completely without importance. The public way of interpreting the self and the world no longer applies. In our everyday life, the repetition of practices and the familiarity with our surroundings give us tranquilized self-assurance and make us feel at home in the world in all its obviousness. The feeling of uncanniness that goes along with angst, instead, discloses the existential mode of not being at home. This is the more primordial phenomenon, even if it remains for the most part existentially uncomprehended. Our ways of living, inhabiting, and taking care of the world represent our answers to that condition of not being at home, which nonetheless constantly pushes Dasein and threatens its everyday lostness in the day, although non-explicitly. At the basis of the relative stability of our everydayness, therefore, there is a longing for orientation, security, and familiarness as answers to the precariousness of our being in the world. By suspending the meaningfulness of everyday life, angst provokes Dasein to reflect upon that which matters most in its existence. Thanks to that, Dasein rediscovers the world itself as possibility. It is caught in its inherent historicity, therefore open to change. In much literature devoted to Heidegger, uncanniness is overshadowed by the prevailingly discussed issue of belonging and emplacement. Displacement is labeled as disturbing, discomforting, bad. It makes the object of a criticism which is at the same time epistemological and political. The disturbing character of displacement, read through the lens of uncanniness, cannot be denied. But sticking to the early insights of being and time, the not being at home of our condition is not just the occasional, unfortunate fall from the more fundamental position of accomplished to dwelling. Indeed, when Dasein is absorbed in the day of the everydayness, when it takes its surroundings for granted, it is fleeing from itself and its primordial condition, not being at home. That does not mean that a happy dwelling cannot be achieved in this life. It just means that no way of living and inhabiting should be taken for granted. Sooner or later, the alien which haunts the familiar, both from without and within, will compel us to reconsider our standards and to approach new possibilities. Okay. Although uncanniness as such can arise in any situation, it is more likely to be elicited in certain historical circumstances. For what concerns our time, the global pandemic is an opportunity to put into question the taken for grantedness of the world and our ways to see and dwell. The pandemic is a key event of the kind of the alien, in the sense given to this term by Waldenfels. Something which bewilders us, eludes our biases, interrupts both the material and symbolic orders in which we have lived so far. It is evident that this is not just a theoretical issue. The pandemic and the actions taken by individuals, local communities, states, and international institutions to limit its spread have had and continue to have huge impact on how people make experience of the world. Both the notions of the alien in Wandelfels and the uncanny in Heidegger can be used to understand that suspension of the taken for grantedness of the world during the pandemic. These notions, in my opinion, are especially suited to investigate the deep changes of our ways of making experience of space and places during the pandemic. Changes in our perception of space affect our ways to dwell, therefore, following Heidegger, have impact at the ontological level. The very idea of feeling, not feeling at home is changing. In the following, I will try to pin down some remarks about the ways we make experience of space and places in the pandemic time in order to address their uncanny character. The first characteristics of our phenomenology of space and places in the pandemic time lies in the contrast between the unprecedented availability and diffusion of digital representations of places at the global level and the experiences of social distancing and confinement connected to the lockdown. Solitary confinement is a traumatic and uncanny experience that occasionally everybody can have. It is not new in human history. What makes the difference in the present context is a contrast between the condition of social confinement imposed by national authorities at the global level and the state of total interconnection of things, places, and people made possible by the pervasive spread of digital technologies on a worldwide scale. Of course, there are digital divides between territories and zones of exclusion in which access to the internet is still not guaranteed. Nonetheless, digital connection now concerns billions of people and has produced deep transformations in the ways people interact. They are fairly uniform at the global level. The experience of social confinement necessitated by COVID-19 consists in a dramatic restriction of the range of motion recognized as juridically and socially legitimate. Solitary confinement stands in stark contrast to a condition in which digital interconnections get even stronger to enable activities that under normal circumstances are performed in presence, such as working and studying. This contrast is even more evident with respect to practices that are inherently spatial, such as traveling. From March 2020 onwards, travel blogs and online travel guides have been sharing articles about how to travel while being stuck at home. Thanks to digital technologies, one can take a virtual museum tour. Google Arts and Culture has partnered with more than 2,500 museums and art galleries around the world to offer interactive exhibits and virtual tours. Guided tours are provided on the YouTube pages of many museums. They are cheap or totally free ways to get in touch with art objects and places from all around the world without moving from home. However, by scrolling through the different pictures of the museum sites and their online exhibitions, it is hard to escape the feeling of we having an object-centered experience, primarily addressed to the site, differently from the total experience of real travel. It has been maintained that the modern era has been dominated by the sense of sight in a way that set it apart from its pre-modern predecessors and possibly its postmodern successor. The increase of attention towards notions of engagement, interaction, and immersion in a variety of disciplines in the last decades testifies to the attempts to overcome the ocular-centric bias of Western culture. While the debate over ocular centrism overflows the boundaries of the decades-long continental philosophy debate to affect the entire postmodern culture, aesthetics and cultural studies have witnessed a boost of attention towards engagement and performance. In parallel, in geography, non-representational approaches in qualitative research about space and place have been elaborated, often in dialogue with the creative arts. Thus, digital studies usually counter the reduction of the cyberspace to a meridoscopic regime by emphasizing the interactive and immersive potential of digital technologies. The least effect of cheaper and free online exhibitions can actually be reduced thanks to technologies which are more complex and more expensive as well. Travel from the armchair can be more engaging thanks to immersive technologies such as augmented reality and virtual reality. Through digital immersivity, an ocular-centric perspective is at least partially overcome, for not only sight, but also other senses are involved in the constitution of a complete perceptual world that is connected to the physical one in various ways. It has been argued that virtual reality has created immense opportunities for the leisure and tourism industries throughout the pre-visit phase, during the trip, and at the post-visit stage. However, the alliance between virtual reality and tourism seems to be weakened by the absence of real spatial experience. In these cases, the simulation of virtual reality may be charged with the task of replacing the spatial movement implied in visiting. But does the simulation attain the desired effect? Is that only a question of how powerful is virtual reality in simulating reality? Or is it only a matter of equally distributing digital tools so as to impress a consistent and homogeneous transition towards post-humanity, as maintained by the most orthodox representatives of transhumanism? The point, in my opinion, is that virtual and augmented realities are usually not designed to replace embodied experience, but to prepare, anticipate, accompany, enhance it. This holds from a phenomenological perspective, which recognizes the ontological power of the digital, but does not accept to cast aside the embodied self and the qualitative nature of places. The very notion of enhancement and extension assume that there is something to be enhanced and extended. That does not necessarily imply that the relationship between the real and the virtual should be thought in mere representationalist or realist terms. According to Bruce Jens, for instance, both real and digital places are made possible by play. By drawing on Eugene Fink, the author argues that play is a sense-creating space which ties together people and objects according to certain rules. In both real and digital places, the human subject finds herself embedded and implicated by things. In both cases, there is a constructive side. They are construed through the establishment of rules embodied in practices and routines. These rules make places possible, but do not exclude exceptions, improvisations, surprises. In short, between the real place and the digital one, there is continuity because the real place is in itself a virtual field of possibilities that may or may not find actualization. The everyday world of real places results from the open and precarious balance between virtualities and actualizations, just as play is virtually constituted by its rules, but exists only when there is at least one actual player. Special practices such as inhabiting, walking, driving, flying, climbing, swimming, cycling are ways to actualize this place, to enliven and realize them. The model of the play can be used not only to grasp the processual and engaging nature of both real and digital places, but also their interconnections. But the other side of the coin is what Jeff Malpass has called the principle of the non-autonomy of the virtual, which consists in the recognition of the fact that the virtual does not constitute an autonomous, independent, or closed system, but it is instead always dependent in a variety of ways on the everyday world within which it is embedded. As a consequence, digital technologies, as immersive as they may be, are supposed to prepare and accompany spatial practices, but are not supposed to replace them. Immersivity is merely representational in character as well, when it is disconnected by spatial interaction. It is a kind of representation of which the fictional traits are laid bare precisely because of the loss of the mimetic reference, regardless of how credible the illusion of immersion is. Virtually enhanced experiences of places without real places are reduced to mere representations without reference, or Baudrillard would have said, simulacra. The model of the play does no longer describe the interconnections between the real and digital places. It can be replaced by the model of the utopias of escape. The expression is drawn from Lewis Mumford and refers to aimless utopias which help people to survive in a world so full of frustrations as the real one. As long as real places become inaccessible in themselves, their digital representations or simulation available from home take a somehow unreal character. They do no longer anticipate a possible travel experience, but refer to a different time in which places were staged, set up, disposed, narrated in order to attract visitors. The accessibility de jure of the world is now suspended. People are confined into their homes, and the elsewhere takes again the character of alterity, which cannot be mastered by a self-centered subjectivity. A purely aesthetic apprehension of remote places is impaired. Travels return to be complex and even dangerous practices, illegal most of the time. It is no coincidence that those spatial practices, which have always been complex, dangerous, and even illegal, such as immigration, have been affected to a lower extent than tourism and leisure travels. Confinement renders the aesthetic, domesticated gaze of the tourist untimely and outdated, somehow even scandalous. The domestication of the gaze produced by the enormous exchange of pictures and representations of place on internet and social media does no longer give shape to any actualization in real experience. The suspension of familiarity is the practical condition for uncanniness to arise. Here, the uncanny is not in geographical displacement, which on the contrary may be highly domesticated, especially in tourism and leisure travels, but in the loss of the reference of the representational world provided by technological devices. Confinement and lockdown are complementary phenomena. It is not just about preventing people from traveling and forcing them to stay at home. Lockdown is about making places objectively inaccessible. Full-scale prohibitions to mobility engender a temporary suspended animation of places, turning them into something similar to non-places, at least insofar as social interactions are suspended within them. As it is well known, Marc Auger has defined non-place as a space which cannot be defined as relational or historical or concerned with identity. He was referring to spaces such as airports, highways, train stations, entertainment parks, but also historical sites consumed in an anonymous and stereotypical ways in the framework of mass tourism. However, to the extent that also in non-places social interactions take place, they might turn into places, at least for some categories of people. For instance, the employees who work permanently at an airport, or couples who have shared their first kiss under the Tour Eiffel. Of course, non-places have been concerned by lockdown along with relational and historical places, such as squares, churches, arcades, markets. During a wide period of lockdown, it is precisely the relational and historical character of places that is put into question. Social interactions take place mostly online, thus losing their inherent spatial dimension. Places, therefore, continue to exist in a ghostly form, devoid of their social function and disembedded from the practices that in normal times enliven them. Their historicity is prima facie reduced to the certainty of what they have been in the past, for their present time is suspended, and their future time appears precarious and uncertain. What humanistic geography has taught us to call sense of place is not granted anymore in a condition in which our dwelling is restricted to the boundaries of our house. The vibrancy of both places and non-places in the classic sense is muted. This uncanny situation makes it possible to take into deeper consideration the real nature of places from a phenomenological perspective. With distant learning and smart working enhanced as never before, the importance of those places where people used to study and work is both relativized and reaffirmed. On one hand, the very fact that the scholastic and work-related functions can be performed in cyberspace shows that the built spaces in which those functions have always been carried out were dispensable. On the other hand, the experiences of distant learning and smart working have raised issues about what is the contribution of places to the quality of both learning and working. Of course, much depends on what kind of work we're talking about. For there are jobs that can carry it out online better than others. But there is more. The question is whether space is just something we can live without, or it actively contributes in giving shape and meaning to social actions. When the function of a spatial entity such as school, a museum, or a square is transferred online, that silent entity where those functions were performed before the lockdown presents itself in its pure form. The suspension of everyday activities emphasizes their purely material patterns, their aesthetic dimension, their belonging with a greater context in which we have learned to carry out our everyday paths. Their very materiality has affective significance to us. Our memories, our imaginative intentions are elicited by them. Places acquire a depth that is usually overlooked in pre-pandemic life. They might be constituted as objects of nostalgia because we feel that a part of our identity has been dropped there. We discovered that the sense of place is also what governs our sense of ourselves. At the same time, as everyday practices within places are suspended, we address them as alterities endowed with an enigmatic significance. With their taking for grantedness being removed, they reveal themselves as the precarious outcomes of morphogenetic processes which have unfolded in time and go largely beyond the bounds of one's personal existence. Places reveal themselves as spatial crystallizations of a cultural history and a natural history, which are often unconsciously removed from everyday understanding. In particular, in Heideggerian terms, the suspension of the everyday word, and I underline word, emphasizes the role of earth in shaping our surroundings. This is why during the lockdown, underwood has thickened, wheatgrass has grown to the detriment of kinds of plantations requiring specific human care. Gardens have set back while the swamp have moved forward. At the same time, the air and the waters have got cleaner and clearer thanks to the limitation of human mobility. A spontaneous nature timidly flourishes in the interstices of our crafted surroundings. The situation is ambiguous. The music and the voices from the balconies of the houses show that the cities are not dead, that their bare forms are not those of a cold corpse in the hands of necrotic agents, but rather of an ill patient who imposed herself a powerful therapy to heal. Just a few more minutes, finishing. Moreover, by being confined at home, we get a clearer idea of how dwelling do not consist just in taking cover behind the reassuring threshold of our houses. When our home is not projected toward the outside, when the transitional character of the threshold is neutralized and is reduced to an insurmountable border, home can hardly achieve those positive values described by Gaston Bachelard in his The Poetic of Space. On the contrary, those alienating experiences which characterize some empirical living condition, such as being lonely and abandoned, as it happens to many elderly people, or cohabiting with a violent man, as it happens to many women, may be intensified. Confinement clearly shows how the alien hounds the intimacy of the familiar fireside. This awareness should not lead toward despair. Rather, it hints at the fact that the own is interwoven with the alien and that man is not a master in his own house. It's clear at this point how the recognition of the historical and relational character of places is not really eradicated by uncanniness, but on the contrary, thanks to uncanniness, we acquire a better sense of the historicity, even the contingency of places, and at the same time, the transitoriness of our terrestrial journey. Through the suspension of the established meanings and senses of places, the way is paved towards a renewal of our way to dwell. Just a short conclusion, I jumped the part, there is no alternative part. Thanks to the quarantine, we may be driven to recognize that the way we look at places is often stereotyped and unresponsive, that our usual way to inhabit and move through the Earth's surface is too invasive, that the population density of our cities is too high, that a merely profit-driven economy is helpless to cope with the contemporary global challenges, and that social and political interactions based only on competition cannot respond to the needs of people. Uncannyness, therefore, not only represents the condition in which we can refresh our view of the world, but also reorients our action in order to make the world a better and more human place to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, for this beautiful and rich presentation. It's for its innovative approach. I was impressed by the references from Bachelard, from Marc Auger to Heidegger. So if we have, if you have questions, please raise your hand so I can see them. Uldis is the first one, and after that, Marcus. Uldis, please.
Thank you, Paolo. Yeah, it was very, very rich and just great analysis involving so many ideas, and I think that this is something which maybe what you are speaking is something which many people do not see, because for a lot of people, you know, that the confinement and the way people are sort of disconnected just means nothing else but that people are isolated from each other. But you using Heidegger's ideas help us understand that this kind of confinement has actually a potentiality for us to revitalize, to refresh our relationship with the world, and thus sort of every alien and strange situation provides us with new opportunities of which we might not be aware of initially. And I think that that's a very beautiful idea. But I mean, if we look, let's say, realistically of how people live, I think that there's still a lot of people who do not realize or are incapable of, grasping this opportunity and actualizing it in their own lives. For example, people who have who are not so good with, for example, internet technologies, and who maybe have impairments that they cannot sort of be mobile, etc. And so what would you say about maybe them, those people who cannot use all the opportunities which, for example, modern technologies and whatnot provides in order to revitalize, our relationship with the world?
Thank you very much. All this. Well, in the part I jumped, I expresses the awareness that just a personal focused perspective, a perspective only on the personal transformation of the gaze is not enough, and that uncanniness should be reinterpreted in the Hannah Arendt's term of the reactivation of what in everyday life is often forgotten, which is the power to act together, which is an idea that I find quite connected to the phenomenological interpretation of power as a characteristic of the transcendental intersubjectivity. So the point is that the word as it is not just as it is by nature, but it is the precarious outcome of multiple agencies, among which the environmental agency, which is autonomous, but there is also transcendental intersubjectivity, which constitutes the world. And concretely, that constitution is not just an epistemological way to say how the world constitutes in our minds, but it is also materially produced by human power. An uncanny moment in history can help rehabilitate this idea, and, for instance, breaks the idea that there is no alternative. There is no alternative has been the only philosophy of history of the last 30 years. And politics has been substantially suspended. We are into the postmodern flux of everything, from the market to the capital, to the people, till the virus. So what is interesting is that this uncanny moment is not just a way for us to refresh our look, but it is a way for politics at the global level to intervene by stopping that flux and making something new. For instance, cooperating in order to spread vaccine in all the world, or cooperating in order to provide money for helping people buying computers. Something which under neoliberal cover of the last 30 years was not acceptable. So I think that there are these two levels, the personal and the intersubjective, one that should be considered. Because if we just focus on how we refresh our look, I believe that it is a naive interpretation of what uncanny, what is the ontological, the transcendental power of the uncanny experience.
Thank you.
The next question, do you want to add something, Uldis?
No, I do not. I have another question, but maybe let's see what Marcus has to ask. And maybe...
Let's hear Marcus' questions, and then we come back to yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Paolo. This was really interesting and quite rich and intense. I like your positive outlook, and that something positive can come out of this pandemic. I guess my question is about this positive outlook, because I wondered, so maybe what you can also say, or what one could say, given your analysis of all of this, is that it might be that so normally this is assumed that nothing positive will come out of this. So we will not learn something positive of this pandemic because we are weak and because we are lazy and we just want to go back to how things were before. And so, but you have a more positive outlook. But maybe one could also say that it's not just because we are weak that nothing will substantially change, but it's because we are now in a state of emergency and in a state of uncanniness, that you mentioned. So we need to go back to a state of normal, of everyday experience, because right now it could not stay the way it is right now. So we could either change things radically, as you mentioned, or we could just try everything we can to go back to the state as is what it was before. So isn't it even more plausible to do the second thing? I guess you need something, some incentive to change radically.
I believe you're perfectly right. I think that there's a possibility, and to keep open possibilities is also the stake of uncanniness. It is not about realizing in reality an utopian condition. To achieve a utopian condition, this is not uncanniness. And it is not the feeling of not being at home. Not being at home is the opportunity to discover that the way we took for granted to inhabit the world and to consider the relationship between world and earth, for instance, was not natural, was not that we reified that through our practices, through our everyday practices, not because of, I don't know, but it is not objective. So from that, one can try to refresh some ideas and to renew the agenda of politicians, the two things together always. But under this respect, I'm quite Kantian in the sense of Kant. So I think that one can figure out what would it be the end. Oh my God, I don't know how to say it in English. The end kingdom. The kingdom of ends of okay, one could figure it out, but the point is not in achieving it completely. Of course, we will remain in a condition where where history is not teaching us. But the opportunity for a refresh of the look, yes, I believe that. And I also saw some change in the political agenda. Here, we should go from the phenomenological to the political, but I'd like to say something on that, because it's true. For the first time, we funded an economic Green Deal in Europe through common debt, thanks to the pandemic. That was impossible. Italy was like Greece until a few was risking to become like Greece a few years ago, but we avoided them because European leaders took common awareness of the fact that this pandemic and the economical effects of this pandemic could not be faced only in a national boundary. It is necessary to struggle together. Is that the better words of the possible ones? No, I wouldn't say so, but there is change.
Yeah, thanks. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you, Paolo. The next question comes from Mintautas, and then we come back to Uldis. Mintautas, please.
My question is, first, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation with such a beautiful end with hope that through the loss restriction and uncanniness we can reevaluate such things. My question is very, very simple. You have very fruitfully exploited Heidegger's concept of uncanniness, and during your presentation, I thought maybe we can here exploit the Heidegger's concept of boredom or Langweiler or something, or anxiety, angst. Maybe you can say about something like
that. Well, I thank you very much. I can say something more of why I have chosen uncanniness and angst, so anxiety and uncanniness connected, because of its geographical implications, specifically. Because uncanniness is, of course, a way through which we refresh our ideas. But uncanniness comes from a condition of disorientation, which is at the beginning inherently spatial. This focus on space is specific to Heidegger, which is also present, I don't know, for instance, in the Hölderlin hymn with the ode to the with the hymn to the river Easter, where Heidegger deals precisely with that mobility, with that contingency of the nature of place, and that is the ontology of place. So an ontology of the impermanence that gathers people and things together in an impermanent but still performative way. To discover that contingency, an uncanny moment is required. And there have been in geography and also in cultural anthropology, literature, having drawn from Heidegger this idea of angst and uncanniness to show how sense of place is what governs, supports, holds our sense of ourselves, and for example, our relationship with the local communities' relationship with their surroundings, sacralization of places, the choice of the place where to put a temple rather than other choices. So uncanniness has uncanniness, for instance, is connected to the word displacement, and displacement is in itself a spatial word, in the sense that it includes the word place, and in French it is dépaillement. So the idea of not finding oneself in a place, not recognizing oneself in a place. And yeah, so I chose that because I didn't want to focus only on the emotional side of the personal subject, because if you do that, you can talk of boredom and of many other emotions that can be connected to social distancing and confinement. I wanted to underline the ontological implication. So uncanniness is an ontological emotion as far as it hints at that condition of places, of displacement. Okay.
Thank you, Paolo. Uldis has another question.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, if we think about the living in the uncanny world, in this disorientation, this is not something I mean most of people can do a long term. You know, like for example, this reminds me of what Descartes said. You know, that when he did his meditation, he says this is something which should be done once in a life, because otherwise, you know, that's not sort of sustainable. You know, it's not possible, you know, to be in an eternal sort of internal state of uncanniness, where you are sort of completely disoriented, you don't know what is what, and so on. And so we can also see this kind of tendency. Actually, I would say there's a dual tendency, because on the one hand, so one way people try to get back to the way they lived before, despite the fact that the world is different, and they try to pretend to live that the world is the same as it was before. And I don't know, there is this term COVID fatigue, you know, that people do not sort of follow the regulations and requests from the government and medical specialists and so on, and that they sort of try to live and pretend as that everything is back to normal again. And on the other hand, this will be the part of a question. We can see that maybe, and this is again in a form of question, that people have started to live, to be at home with the virus. That the pandemic situation is for them being at home rather than not being at home anymore. That so people get used to being in the situation, and they take it as the new normal. And so my question in this context is: so is it possible that so what at first is uncanny becomes sort of normalized and becomes sort of absent in this sense that, you know, I do not anymore wonder about things. I just take them for granted. That, for example, I have to have Zoom. I cannot, for example, give kisses to my friends. I cannot hug him, and so on. And that this becomes sort of habitual again, and so this potential of the uncanniness is lost. So my question is: so should not we sort of seize the moment of uncanniness and use its potential as quickly as possible? Otherwise, other people will sort of go back to the previous ways of living. At least they will try that, or they will assume it as the new normality and again take things for granted, and so nothing will come out of this.
Thank you very much. The answer from a theoretical point of view, in my opinion, is yes. It is perfectly possible, because uncanniness is the most fundamental condition of being in the world, but at the same time connected to answers to it. It is fundamental, but it is fundamentally connected to the struggle of people to answer to that displacement condition through everyday practices, trying to desever in Heideggerian terms, deseverance. So trying to creating words of things, of signs, of ready-to-hand objects through which we recognize ourselves. This is the other part, of course. So Heidegger is all about, for how I understood that, his paradoxical trait, which is very interesting in my opinion, is everything is about belonging and displacement, belonging and displacement. So, of course, uncanniness alone is unbearable. Uncanniness alone would be the tragic conception of life of Nietzsche. Is a condition according to which all practices that normalize social life and form are ideological. So we should get free of them and become super people, Übermenschen. But that is not the case of uncanniness. That is absolutely not the idea of Heidegger, of a phenomenology in general, of Ricoeur, etc. We know that we have to answer to that condition through through practices that normalize our life and make possible the relationships within people and objects and surroundings. The point, I think, is not to take them for granted. If we, for example, start to take for granted the new condition in which we stay at home and we don't visit other parts of the world are not accessible anymore, the risk that I see in that new normality is that we, for instance, start to think that what happens in other parts of the world so far is that far away from us that does not concern us. New form of localism that might be implicitly connected to that closing boundaries, you know? So against the normality of neoliberal the neoliberal flow, we would have another normality of localism, of staying put just with people who looks like us and consider impossible to approach the elsewhere. I think this is problematic too, and it is so because we take for granted that our home is just what takes us at the repair of what is outside. I don't know if I answered to that.
Thank you, Paolo. If there are no more questions, I will have one, final one. So I was, for Paolo, I was wondering, you talk about boundaries, about new localism. I was wondering if this analysis in terms of uncanniness applies only to Western societies or to the rest of the world. Because I was thinking about Asian societies or African societies where pandemics or epidemics are something usual. Let's think about Ebola epidemics or in the Asian societies. In 2004, there was a coronavirus, local, but there was something similar to what is lived by the Western society as something new, as something shocking, as something shattering. So how do you see the limits of your analysis, if there are, and how do you see this possible comparison between the way Western society lives the coronavirus pandemics and the other societies, the African or the Asian society experienced the same pandemics? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Here there is a philosophical point and a political point. And for what concerns the philosophical point, I have always been aware of the Eurocentric bias of my description. Absolutely. Also, this description of the impact of technology, that my choice of focusing on the special experiences of tourism and just touching en passant the idea that there are other practices such as, for instance, migrations that do not respond to the same analysis I made here, is Eurocentric. So from a philosophical point of view, and specifically from a phenomenological point of view, my question was, is this phenomenology or my description just stay at the level of the psychologistic, historical, grounded context dimension? Okay, I don't know if I explained me, because phenomenological description should be at the transcendental level. Uncanniness is a transcendental idea, but how uncanniness emerge within a social context is a content analysis, which is not at the level of descriptive eidetics. The answer I provided myself is with the help of Ricoeur, because according to Ricoeur, our descriptive eidetics cannot be really emancipated, separated by an hermeneutical awareness of our belonging with a context, a description. Our belonging with a context provide us with some insight on how certain experiences are lived within that context. So probably my description is not a purely phenomenological description, but I don't think it is either a merely psychologistic one, because it proposes itself as a sort of hermeneutics of lived experience of places and spaces from within the context I know, by adopting that perspective methodologically, I also admit the limits of that analysis, and I think that it should be complemented by other clarifications of experiences that come from within other contexts. Because if I, from my within, wanted to describe the experiences of spaces and places of other faraway contexts that I don't know very well and I don't belong with, I could do that from an objective point of view, in the sense of, I don't know, history, geography, space, but that wouldn't be a description of geography, a description of phenomenological description anymore. That would be a social science, and social science should do that, should generalize its claims. But I'm not capable of doing that from within, from the phenomenological perspective of someone who is looking to clarify his own experience also. Okay, so I don't know if it's satisfying, but it is the boundary of the border of my.
Thank you, Paolo. It's a good answer, and I'm very satisfied with it.